Well, first of all, I don't know whether I'm confronting the traditional British understatement there. You qualified your notion that if this had been a white on black crime, maybe the Washington Post and the New York Times would have picked it up. I can only say, are you kidding me?
Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. On Tuesday this week, we recorded this interview, which I hope you're about to watch, with Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute about the shocking crime of the murder of Iryna Zarutska on a light rail train in Charlotte, North Carolina last month. Since we've recorded, of course, the odious murder of Charlie Kirk on stage in Utah has occurred. We still think it's worth putting out this earlier interview, which is also about violent crime, although we go in a rather different direction. I encourage you all to watch it, and thank you for tuning in. Heather, this is a fairly familiar story, is it not, of horrific violence happening on a transport system in an American city, and yet it seems to have tapped into something that's going on in the zeitgeist somehow. What's happening here? Well,
I don't think we've ever seen quite this degree of a video up to the moment. We've not been allowed to see the actual stabbing, but it is to observe this violent act, deliberate act on camera is truly earth-shattering. And to imagine what this woman went through in that moment of pain. And it may be that we now have a break in the wall of silence and lies around crime in America. The notion that our main problem is white supremacy is being rejected by the president. He is saying, you can't scare me by calling me a racist. And the biggest lie in America today is around the criminal justice system. And the idea that that system is racist and that whites are the biggest threat to blacks, that is simply not the case. National data after national data show that, in fact, it is blacks who are the main threat to whites. A National Academy of Sciences study from 2023. This is a highly prestigious science establishment. In other words, very, very left-leaning. The two terms are synonymous. Said that there is virtually no white-on-black homicide in the United States, and that blacks are 35 times more likely to commit an act of violence against a white person than a white person is to commit an act of violence against a black person. People that have been in crime situations know this reality, and yet the mainstream media, the Democratic establishment, has imposed on this country an absolute falsehood, which is that it is blacks that are victimized by the criminal justice system. And it may be that the time is finally running out on that narrative.
I mean, why, beyond just political correctness, why do you think there is this sort of wall of silence about the actual numbers involved of black on white crime and vice versa?
Well, I think it is political correctness. I think Americans have very deep well of racial guilt, and they have spent decades trying to solve inner city pathologies without any success. And they would rather not look at this head on. It's a very depressing reality, and they've been taught to believe that to speak the facts about Black cultural breakdown is to brand themselves as racist, and they won't do that.
Well, you can understand why people don't want to go there, because if you do go there, you have to ask what you're going to do with the fact that you've gone there. I mean, well, do we want to live in a society, do Americans want to live in a society where black men are automatically viewed with suspicion because they are black? Presumably the answer is no.
I would say that's already happening, and lies contribute to that more than the truth. The lies contribute to the fact that we are not incarcerating criminals. somebody in American society, some cabal or, coalition of the elites have decided that it is better not to incarcerate criminals than to incarcerate criminals and incarcerate disproportionately Black criminals. But you cannot have law enforcement and avoid disparate impact at the same time, because the Black crime rate is so astronomically higher. The bodies don't lie. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 are killed in gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites in that same cohort. And they're not being killed by the police. They're not being killed by whites. The reason that Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites is because they're committing gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites. And so it's just the facts. In Los Angeles, Blacks are 57 times more likely to commit a violent crime than whites are. Where do we get this data? Not from the racist police. We get it from the victims of and witnesses to those violent crimes, who are themselves usually minorities. But as we see, not always. And when it comes to, as I say, interracial crime, that's equally disparate. But we have decided to dismantle our criminal justice system in order to avoid disparate impact. And I would say, if we were simply honest that this is the source of crime, it's not a function of police racism, that the reason that there are a disparate number of Blacks in prison, and frankly, the overall numbers are not as wildly disparate as one might imagine. Blacks make up about a third of the national prison population. That encompasses both the state and the federal system, even though they're about 13% of the population. So it's about a 3-to-1 ratio. Individual crimes, it's a much higher disparity. I think there would be much more to be gained by saying, look, the police don't want this. They can't help it when they're called to a drive-by shooting scene, that they are almost always being given the identity of a Black suspect if anybody's cooperating with the police. Let the criminal justice system work to protect those thousands of law-abiding Blacks in the inner city who are trying to run businesses, who are trying to take their children to school, who are trying to attend 4th of July barbecues without getting their kids, their toddlers, shot in the head in drive-by shootings. Let's put our emphasis on saving the victims and not apologizing for and shielding the victims. But Freddie, this is a function of a much larger problem, which I call the great inversion, which is that government has completely turned its obligations overhead. It's overturned them. It's all backwards. The government now sees its mission as protecting the dysfunctional and the antisocial against the alleged threat of the law-abiding among us, the bigots, and heaps rights after rights after rights on vagrants, on the psychotic, drug-addicted, mentally ill who are a known risk, and treat the citizens as afterthoughts, as simply ATMs to fuel the social justice projects. That has to end. The obligation of government is to protect the law-abiding, the hardworking, those who want to succeed and are exercising personal responsibility, from the antisocial, not vice versa.
Can you explain a little bit about disparate impact for our British viewers? Because it's a well-known phrase in America, but British people might not know exactly what it is. What's its genesis? How does it apply itself in the American legal system and the American justice system? And is it relevant to this case of DeCarlos Brown Jr., who it seems was arrested 14 times and was out on cashless bail when he committed this crime?
Disparate impact is relevant not only to Brown, but to basically the entire criminal justice system in America. It is the concept that is fueling this wave of de-incarceration and decriminalization. The civil rights laws of the 1960s forbade overt discrimination. It forbade people associated with the government, with government contracts, from saying, I'm not going to hire blacks because I think I just don't want them on my workplace. And so I'm affirmatively discriminating against particular races, above all blacks. It was banning intentional discrimination. By the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, that concept was not netting enough discriminators in the eyes of the civil rights enforcers. And so a new concept was developed in the advocacy legal community called disparate impact that was embraced and validated in 1971 by a Supreme Court case, Griggs Power, Duke v. Griggs Power, I think, that held that an employer can be non-discriminatory. He can have no intention to exclude blacks from his workplace, but he has a literacy test, say, that he thinks measures a baseline of skills necessary to work in his power plant, to be able to read manuals, follow instructions, know what to do if there's a meltdown in the generating capacity. If that non-discriminatory employer has a set of job standards that have a negative impact on blacks, that is, if more blacks fail that job test than whites, and so they're not being hired at rates proportional to their population or to their applicant population, that test is deemed to be a covert way of discriminating. And with this one idea, you basically dismantled meritocratic standards across the board. You can have now, under disparate impact, you can have meritocracy or you can have diversity. You cannot have both. Any standard, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's hiring, saying we want cognitive skills, we want writing, we want reading, fire exams, we want you to be able to read chemical manuals, we want teachers that can have basic levels of numeracy and literacy. All those tests have been thrown out because they have disparate impact on blacks, not because anybody is alleging, except that sort of gets brought in sotto voce implicitly, but that you don't need to show intent to discriminate. All you need to show is that blacks are failing at a higher rate on objective meritocratic tests. And that's what's going on here. The reason that these career criminals are not being held is because we've made it very, very difficult to hold them because we don't want to put more blacks in prison. It's not that our criminal justice laws are racist. They are not. They're immaculately colorblind. And it's not like literacy tests are racist. The problem there is the academic skills gap is so great. 66% of Black 12th graders cannot do the most basic 12th grade math, defined, Freddie, merely as being able to do arithmetic and read a linear graph. So when you have that degree of academic failure, it is absurd to assume that absent discrimination or an unfair test, you're going to have proportional representation in science labs or in law school faculties or students admitted to medical school. So the disparate impact concept is driving the entire war on standards in the United States. It affects science, it affects medicine, and it sure as heck affects criminal justice.
And it connects to this concept which we've discussed before of equity as opposed to equality, and that somehow a bit of unfairness towards non-black people in America, whites and Asians in academic selections, and perhaps whites in the criminal justice system, is justified because it's a sort of payback against a much longer period of injustice against black people before. Am I barking up the right tree there?
I've never heard it described quite that explicitly, that may be, in fact, the underlying um, motivation, which is just vengeance. And, that's a normal human emotion. One can kind of understand that. I think equity is probably at least whitewashed, if your analysis is correct, by one of the older justifications, which is that if people are starting out from a much less endowed position, they're way behind on the race, it's unfair to expect them to succeed at the same level, and we've got to give them boost, or we've got to give them credit for trying. Again, that may be a good idea, though it doesn't work out that way. There used to be a little bit more honesty in reporting on the effect of racial preferences in college admissions, which are ubiquitous, and we'll see if Trump is able to extract enough truth from the universities that he can smoke out the enduring racial preferences that are still being accorded by saying, give us your data. We want to look at the test scores and GPAs of Blacks who were admitted and the whites and Asians who were admitted, and we want to compare the GPAs and SATs of the Blacks who were admitted to those of Asians and whites who were rejected. But it used to be, I remember one particular story in the New York Times in the 90s that was writing about this, and it spoke to some Black high school students. This is our pre-college, 4 years before college. And they basically said, I don't have to work as hard because I'm Black. And so they knew, even though they'll deny it in other contexts, that the standards had been lowered and they didn't need to make the same effort. And that is certainly a very rational response to double standards. And that's what you get, not, oh, well, we're going to acknowledge, that you've got problems in your ancestry, that America was in fact an egregiously cruel, racist, nasty, mean-spirited country towards Blacks. And therefore, we're not going to have the same expectations. When you lower expectations, people perform down to the expectations.
But we should say that, America was a cruel and nasty place for Black Americans for a very long time. And that today, partly as a result of civil rights law, partly as a result of some of these actions, which we may think have very negative consequences in certain areas, a lot of African Americans, a lot of Black Americans are able to succeed where they weren't before, and that is a good thing.
Of course it is, absolutely. And, there are a lot of Black parents that understand the bourgeois values that kids need two parents. This is a whole discussion, and it's become, frankly, tiresome to me because conservatives and I and others like me have been arguing this since the 1990s, and there's nothing new to say, but there's just the number of ways in which the traditional biological two-parent family is superior are vast, and it goes way beyond economics. But if that's all you care about, you've got twice as many resources, both financial and kinship in a two-parent family. But there's lots of Black parents that realize the children need their mother and their father, and they need to have somebody who is monitoring their homework, who is saying, I expect you to perform. I am going to make sure that you're not running the streets at night. It's those things that are essential. It is the bourgeois virtues, as Amy Wax would say, of deferred gratification, personal responsibility. Now, it's also very typical for the sort of more of the left to say one of the argument for preferences working and the goodness of racial preferences is to say, well, look at Sonia Sotomayor got preferences at Yale Law School and before, and look at, she ended up on the Supreme Court. Therefore, the preferences worked, as if there was ever a moment when there were no preferences. So, and the fact is there never is, every single step of the way. Just as for me, being a female, it makes me sick, but I am undoubtedly chosen for panels, chosen to speak, chosen to write because I'm a female. And that never ends either. And I find that utterly nauseating, insulting, but I'm not going to take it personally and feel victimized by it. I just find it ludicrous. I'm going to be very deflationary here, Freddie, but a certain amount of that Black middle class success is itself the result of racial preferences. If we, and I think this is going to be one of the big tests for Americans, because if institutions were to follow the mandate that was handed down in 2023 by the Supreme Court that said no more racial preferences in higher education, and the Trump administration is trying to take that logic and extend it to greater areas of not just government, but the private sector, it's going to be a very different educational landscape. The elite schools are going to have almost no Blacks in them. Harvard did its own study before the recent Supreme Court case, and it looked at its admissions data. At that point, Blacks were about 10% of the undergraduate student body. And if it got rid of racial preferences, this is Harvard speaking, it would have less than 1% Black students. And Harvard gets the cream of the cream. Harvard gets every top performer across the country. And yet there are not enough competitively qualified Black students in all of the United States to be proportionally represented at Harvard. We're going to see this in medical schools. We're going to see it in law schools. We would see it in firms. And the question to me is, will Americans see this? And of course, the advocacy groups will be screaming bloody murder about this and say, whoa, this is a reality we can't look head on, bring back the preferences. We'll see. But as I say, my basic point is, it is impossible at this point to disentangle what extent of advancement for any group that's the so-called beneficiary preferences, to what extent that's because of preferences and to what extent it's because of actual merit. And, this is not me speaking. There was a law professor at Yale, he's still there, Stephen Carter, in the 1990s. He wrote a book called Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby. And he wrote about his own personal dilemma. He said, I never know when I'm hired for a job or chosen if it's because I'm the best candidate or because I'm the best Black candidate. And that's a real question. And it haunted him. And that's the dilemma that any honest recipient of preferences has to confront.
Going back to crime, and this particular crime, we're seeing fury on social media about the absence of reporting on this attack in mainstream media publications. And it is certainly true that if it had been the other way around, if a young Black man had been stabbed by a white man, or a young Black woman had been stabbed by a white man, it probably would have been picked up more by the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on. But is rage against the media on this really what we should be doing, or is it should be angry at the media and all of the other institutions that incorporate their bias into the way they operate?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether I'm confronting the traditional British understatement there. You qualified your notion that if this had been a white on Black crime, maybe the Washington Post and the New York Times would have picked it up. I can only say, are you kidding me? This would have been an international story. This would have catapulted around the world in about 5 seconds. And there would have been a great hurrah of elation from every elite across the globe at finally an instantiation again, of a few cases of white supremacy. So I think, number one, that media rage is completely justified. People feel like they are being lied to, that they are being given a completely phony view of reality. There was this sort of it's now kind of an infamous posting on Axios that went up the day after, or went after the video came out, because this crime happened on August 22nd. It's just taken a while to sort of filter through the system. But Axios wrote a story, and what they for them, they said the big picture of what's going on here. The big picture was not crime. The big picture was that surveillance cameras act as an accelerant, and they create a visual counterpart, as they say, to statistics showing that crime is decreasing. So as far as Axios went, this was a story about, we're losing control of the media, these goddamn cameras, we can't suppress the facts any longer. So yes, I think the anger at the media is justified, but it should also be anger at our legislatures. We have, and you guys ran a fantastic piece about the two-tier system of justice, and the fact that you have deliberate, explicit, in Hennepin County, Minnesota, you have a prosecutor, and she's typical, saying, I want you to take race into consideration when you consider plea bargains for defendants. That is, when you decide whether to actually seek a prison term, go to trial, or whether you're just going to negotiate with the defendant a much lower sentence, maybe just, parole or probation, not even home confinement. Race should be part of that. California has an absolutely pernicious act called the Racial Justice Act, which allows defendants to contest their prosecution on the grounds not that their individual prosecution was biased. They don't have to show that, but on the fact that they claim that in the past, they've got a statistical pattern that there was bias in the past. Well, this has problems for two reasons. Number one, the past is not relevant to the present. And number two, the statistical studies are all bogus. But the Racial Justice Act in California is emblematic. And this was passed by the California legislature. It was signed by the governor. It got very little attention, actually, from the media, because it was Floyd, race riots, and COVID. But yes, there are many more people that are responsible. There's a post going around today. The MacArthur Foundation, the source of these phony genius awards that are overwhelmingly left wing, they gave millions of dollars to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg County, where the stabbing occurred, to decrease racial disparities in their jail system. Translation: figure out ways not to put Black criminals in jail. So it's beyond the media. It is academia. It is NGOs, which I have developed an absolute visceral loathing for. It is government. Used to be big corporations. So we may be facing a reckoning. As I say, to me, the big question of the moment is the Trump revolution going to last? And is he going to serve as the role model for people that just don't give a damn any longer about being called a racist and just want to live with truth?
Well, there is another aspect to this, Heather, which I want to discuss with you, and I hope you don't think I'm being wet or British in bringing it up, which is the video element of it. Because we saw with George Floyd a video that creates an emotional response, a sort of crying out for justice, can cause amazingly large, often angry, violent reactions. And in this particular crime, we don't actually see the murder, but we see the bit before, and we see the blood on and it triggers emotions. And it sometimes occurs to me that social media is a very bad place to litigate crimes, and we seem to be doing a lot of it based on our emotional responses to videos. And I wonder if this is just a big problem we're going to have with justice in future, is that it's about the way the mob reacts to snippets of footage.
That's a very good question. And I would say when one is trying to understand reality, you do have to balance individual stories, anecdotes against data. And sometimes they work in tandem. Other times the allegation is they don't, and we're seeing that here with the to the extent there's a mainstream media response to this incident, but you saw it with Axios that, well, visual counterpoint to the statistics showing crime is down. This is the story after during the Washington, D.C. National Guard deployment. Well, crime is down, crime is down, crime is down. In D.C., yes, it's down from its post George Floyd race riot high, but so what? It's down. It's still at a level that is completely unacceptable, should be unacceptable in a civilized society. So I would say that, for one thing, the videos can do good, because otherwise people really don't have a gut understanding of the horrors of crime. And it's out of sight, out of mind. That having been said, I'm now going to reverse myself. I also feel when there are round-the-clock coverage of a police shooting, I'll say that is against the data, that if you look at the data, these types of incidents are extremely rare. Often the video does not provide sufficient context of why the officer felt he needed to use force. Sometimes it's a clearly bad shooting. Other times it's much more ambiguous. So I'm trying, like, quickly here to figure out, am I just involved in the usual double standards that both sides of the political spectrum engage in? You know, they'll find their own analyses legit, and they'll call out the other side. And I'm trying to distinguish here from the way I do feel the media illegitimately sensationalizes those individual instances, say, of police killings from the facts. And this instance, where I would say, for one thing, this is consistent with the facts. If you're talking about either, if you let's just take it out of race, and it's consistent with the facts about interracial crime, but it's also consistent with the facts about the abomination of allowing these mentally ill, psychotic people, and they're undoubtedly drug users. This is an acronym in American psychological parlance, MICAs, mentally ill chemical abusers, MICA. Mentally ill people that use drugs or abuse substances have a much higher rate of violence. It's completely predictable. And yet, because of the great inversion, we've decided to allow these people to colonize the streets. We're protecting their phantom rights. We're not demanding that they get into mental institutions or get into penal institutions to protect public safety. We're protecting them from the demands of the public. And so these types of crimes, as you mentioned in your introduction, Freddie, they are happening regularly on subways in New York City. These psychotic people are pushing people in front of subways. They're stabbing them. They're coming up from behind. So I would say that this is an instance where it is the anecdote and the statistics are consonant. Is it every single day? No, but it's far more than we should be asked to tolerate, because it is a certainty that in the next couple weeks, couple months, there will be another incident somewhere where somebody who is mentally ill, drug addicted, untreated, vagrant will commit a crime. It's just a certainty. This could all be prevented by having sensible law enforcement and by having real commitment of the mentally ill. They should not be allowed to be on the streets, whether that's a question of simply enforcing the laws on the books and saying, sorry, this is a standard. We're putting down a marker. We do not allow this as a civilized society. It may require changes of the laws of commitment, which have gone way, way too far in the direction of individual liberty. The radical civil libertarians like Thomas Sass denied that there was even such a thing as mental illness. That's the root of a lot of our deinstitutionalization laws, that you can't infringe upon individual autonomy. Again, great inversion. What about the autonomy of the law-abiding? That's who government should care about.
Heather McDonald, it's always fascinating talking to you, but we better end it there. Thank you very much for coming on to Americano.
My pleasure, Freddie. Thank you.